Under a week to the Olympic trade freeze, and there's absolutely no doubt the New York Rangers are moving Artemi Panarin. The only question now is when and where to. To speak to that, here's our insider, Pierre LeBrun. Pierre, the Rangers have said they're not even going to dress their leading scorer because they don't want to risk an injury to him. So how did we get here, and where do you see this headed?
Yeah, I mean, Gino, just for some background, it started back on January 16th when the Rangers put out that letter that was very public about their retool. On that same day, GM Chris Drury, we understand, met with Panarin and said, we're not signing you. We'll work with you and your agent to trade you. And by the way, I think that news was really hard for Panarin to digest. I know it's obvious to the rest of us that they weren't going to re-sign a 34-year-old pending UFA. But I think for him, it really hit him hard. So that's important to remember as this plays out. In the meantime, his agent, Paul Theofanis, has had the green light from the Rangers to speak directly to teams, Gino. And that's not only relevant because the player has a full no move, so they control a lot of this, but because, as we understand it, Panarin would like to get an extension through this trade whenever that happens. In other words, fast forward July 1st to right now in late January and pick his next team. And that is complicated things because I think there are some teams that would have looked at him more as a rental but aren't ready to get into a big extension with him. It's absolutely the opposite for some other teams, and I'll tell you why in a second. Let's start, for example, with the Washington Capitals. They do have interest in Artemi Panarin. Where it goes from there, we'll see. But the extension part makes a whole lot of sense for them because they're not sure of making the playoffs, Gino, where they are in the standings today. Mm-hmm. So the extension would make it a more intelligent move if they end up with him. Not to mention, by the way, we still don't know if Alex Ovechkin is going to retire or not at the end of the year. And if he does, is Panarin, a replacement. So Washington has interest, makes sense that they're in there. My understanding is that the Panarin camp has reached out to all three California teams, Anaheim, LA, and San Jose. The Ducks, there's the Joel Quenneville connection from their time together in Chicago, Panarin and Quenneville. But I'm told the Ducks are out right now. And the reason for that is the extension doesn't make sense for them, Gino. They've got a lot of young core guys to sign here in the next year or two. And spending, 4 years times 10 or 11 million a year, whatever you believe the extension might end up at, doesn't really make sense for Anaheim. So I've got Anaheim out. Have the Sharks talked to them? Yes. My understanding is the Sharks have had a discussion with the Rangers. We know Mike Greer and Chris Drury have a history. Work together in New York. But beyond that conversation, I'm not sure how serious San Jose wants to be here. They just traded for Sherwood. They just signed Wenberg. So I wouldn't have San Jose as a front runner right now. We'll see. LA can't score. They got a ton of salary cap room starting next summer, retirement of Kopitar. But guess what? They need a center more than a winger. So I guess what I would say on the Kings is I just get the feeling that Ken Holland is just staying in there to see where it goes. But again, I don't sense that the Kings are pushing that hard. Carolina Hurricanes have talked about it. What a shock. The Hurricanes love all the shiny new toys that might be out there on the market. The part that, listen, we know the Hurricanes have talked about it via sources. The part that I struggle with, Gino, is Tom Dundon really going to dole out that kind of money on an extension for Panarin? Does Panarin fit stylistically with the Hurricanes and how they play? So I don't know. Just things that I think about. And if I had to think of a team that would probably be number one on Panarin's list, I would say the Florida Panthers, like almost every other player in the league. But how could Florida really make that happen with their cap situation? So I struggle to make the math work there, but worth mentioning them. And obviously there are other teams, but that's a bit of a glimpse where things might be right now.
It's so funny because, Pierre, it almost sounds like we're talking about Panarin coming up to July 1st free agency rather than coming up the trade deadline. But in many ways, it's being handled in a similar fashion. And also, Pierre, depending on what happens over the next week or so, we could see another major seller from the Metro Division. And it's a team with some pretty attractive assets as well.
Yeah, so the Columbus Blue Jackets, who are now 6-1 under Rick Bowness since the coaching change. You always say, why are coaches always get fired? This is why coaches get fired, sadly, is that more times than not, there's a coaching bump, and it's why it's so attractive to teams. The Blue Jackets don't want to be sellers, Gino. They hope that this run under Rick Bowness continues and that they're solidly back in the playoff race by the time the Olympic break comes next week. My understanding is that the Blue Jackets want to see where they are at the Olympics and then decide if they're buyers or sellers. If they're sellers, if let's say they get a few losses next week and it sours their hope for a playoff run, they could really dramatically change the market. Because one of the problems we've had so far, Gino, or the frustration I hear from contenders, is that there's not enough teams that are selling. The Blue Jackets have a bunch of interesting pending UFAs. They have Boone Jenner. They have Mason Marchment, who they traded for, but it was always the possibility of flipping him. They have Charlie Coyle, Eric Branson. I will tell you, Charlie Coyle getting a lot of calls, which tells you how few centers there are on the trade market. A lot of teams want to know what Columbus will do with Charlie Coyle. Between all this, Gino, there's a chance that some of these players get extended. Boone Jenner is such a popular player there in Columbus, so maybe he gets signed, maybe other guys get moved. But at the end of the day, it's about Columbus announcing if they're in or out, and they haven't made that announcement yet.
What about Minnesota? Bill Guerin took a huge swing by bringing in Quinn Hughes. The Wild have the most points in the West since that deal, and he may not be done yet, Pierre.
Not if he has his way. I mean, our understanding is that Bill Guerin is really sizing up the center market around the NHL ahead of the trade deadline. I'm guessing it's more of a post-Olympics move for Minnesota, but you never know if it happens for next week. He just wants to know who's available. And listen, I think Ryan O'Reilly would be perfect for Bill Guerin and the Minnesota Wild. I just don't know that Ryan O'Reilly is available yet. You know, the Predators have been competitive, and Ryan O'Reilly, I don't think, wants to quit on things there in Nashville. So I don't know if he's actually on the market. Vincent Trocheck, the Rangers are selling. We just talked about it. Trocheck, Bill Guerin has a connection to him through Team USA. I think that's a player of interest to Minnesota. I just mentioned Charlie Coyle. I believe the Wild have checked in with Columbus on Charlie Coyle. So wherever you see center between now and March 6th, think of Bill Guerin and the Minnesota Wild, because that's what they hope to do. They're in a division with Colorado and Minnesota. They're probably going to play Dallas, Colorado and Dallas. They're probably going to play the Stars in the first round. They're all in, to be sure, in Minnesota.
All right, lots going on. That's the early edition of Insider Trading. The full version with Pierre, CJ, and Dregs is coming up on the early edition of SportsCenter.